Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. It's about 10 after 4 in the afternoon here on the East Coast of the United States. My guest, of course, is a Judging Freedom favorite, Phil Giraldi, former CIA operative and agent who had the courage to tell them to go fly a kite, probably in language stronger than that. Phil, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Judging Freedom.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
Of course, you wrote a great piece at a website with which, of course, you know I'm familiar since I write regularly for it, LouRockwell.com, entitled War Without End, subtitled, What is Wrong with the United States of America? Now, of course, we're not going to go back to 1776 or even back to Woodrow Wilson and FDR. You're talking about today, what is wrong with the United States of America? What is it?
Well, the way it's manifest, obviously, is the fact that we've become addicted to war, and many observers have noted this. But I think that the serious problem is that the constitutional restraints on going to war have basically disappeared over the course of the past 20 years.
Yes.
And we have presidents that feel empowered, starting with George W. Bush, to start their own wars and run their own wars and fund their own wars without any consent process, without any political process of the American people indicating that this is the kind of policy they want.
So 50 years ago, Congress enacted, almost 50 years ago, it was 1973, the War Powers Resolution, which basically liberated the president to start any war for 90 days and then continue it for another 90 days, as long as he told Congress, before Congress could stop him. President Nixon vetoed it. He thought it crimped his style. He thought it impaired on presidential prerogative. To me and to you and to those of us who believe that the Constitution means what it says, it liberated him. What is Congress going to do when the troops are in harm's way and they've been there for 180 days? Say you got to skedaddle out of there, even if they're shooting at you. But you're right, George W. and his successors have taken that Nixonian experience, which was intended to prevent another incursion into Cambodia like Nixon did in Vietnam. They have taken that experience and used it to justify all kinds of military incursions. I was once asked to testify before the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee on Republican offered legislation to expand the president's war-making powers. Expand? He has none under the Constitution. Only the Congress can make war, declare war, and only the president can wage it. But you're right, every president, even Donald Trump, has started these wars, has engaged the military, or, as Barack Obama liked to do, used the CIA, so he didn't even have to report under the War Powers Resolution. But the danger now, as you see it, is what might happen in Ukraine. What is Joe Biden up to with respect to boots on the ground, American boots on the ground in Ukraine, Phil?
Well, it's beyond any doubt, there are American boots on the ground in Ukraine. It's just a question of what uniform they're wearing or whether they're not wearing a uniform at all and are in civilian clothes and are possibly drawn from the CIA. So the issue is that we have an imperial presidency, which is increasingly backed up by no dissent coming from Congress. And to a certain extent, the article you referred to is where I'm talking about how this has become a bipartisan fact that no one among even the progressives in the Democratic Party dare to stand up against the imperial presidency. And many of the Republicans, like Liz Cheney, who denounces some critics in the Republican Party as Putin surrogates, basically. These people are also fully on board to the war story for what America is all about.
Wasn't there a letter that the sort of the Bernie Sanders crowd, but in the House, the progressives in the House had all signed saying stop supplying military equipment and money to the war machine in Ukraine, and then they changed their minds, and then somebody leaked the letter? Or what happened with that?
Well, that was a letter that apparently was negotiated among progressives in the Democratic Party, and also I discovered yesterday by entering into additional discussions with some conservative style journalists. They were basically looking for a common ground to urge the administration to enter into or make such preparations that would permit the entry into negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, which would seem like an admirable objective. But the fact is, within 24 hours of this letter actually surfacing, urging this kind of action, they turned around and said they renounced it. They said basically this was a step too far, that they fully supported, fully funding the war in Ukraine until we win.
But do these politicians have any courage or intestinal fortitude whatsoever? I mean, their hearts and their heads were in the right place with the letter, although I don't think we need negotiation. As Doug McGregor, our colleague and friend, says, you could bring about a ceasefire with one phone call from Biden, Joe, to Putin, Vladimir. They want negotiations for a ceasefire. Okay, that's at least thinking in the right direction. The word leaks out, and what? The hawks in the Democratic Party and the hawks in the Republican Party beat the crap out of these people and they change their minds?
Well, that's precisely what happened. Obviously, this was a 24-hour process whereby the shall we say the leaders of the Democratic Party, the people who have crafted this policy of constant warfare and particularly supporting the war in Ukraine to defeat Russia and do whatever it takes to win. These people with the policy are in charge, and basically they made them back down. And the Republicans, of course, are manifesting the same sort of thing, where Liz Cheney is denouncing these people as Putin's stooges. And there's clearly a consensus within the party that the war is basically something that has to be completed one way or another. And the Republicans are not quite sure how to do that.
So Ron Paul argues, our mutual friend, Ron Paul argues that it doesn't matter who wins the midterms because both parties, or at least a majority from each party, is still going to continue in both houses of Congress, will still continue to support Joe Biden's war machine. This is not going to stop. They don't care about the will of the voters. They care about the military-industrial complex and this crazy idea that Anthony Blinken and the people around Biden have, that somehow they can push Putin out of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what they think. And as I pointed out, I think in the article referring to an earlier article, we, the voters, who do we vote for if we're anti-war? I mean, there's nobody. Tulsi Gabbard was, and she was forced out basically of the Democratic Party because of that. And when you have these conservative, these progressives who have been screaming about liberal policies and about wokeism and everything like that, and they can't even come out with a suggestion that we should be negotiating some kind of ceasefire or some kind of way to end the fighting. And this strikes me as astonishing.
What's even more astonishing is their wish that we fight there until victory is obtained. Now, when you said that in your piece, you had quotes around the word victory. Do they even know what they're talking about? What do they mean by victory? According to the president of Poland, victory would mean taking Crimea back from the Russians. Well, that's not going to happen any more than taking Moscow away from the Russians is going to happen.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I mean, the U.S. policy, insofar as you can figure out what it is essentially that all of these areas that are now controlled by Russia have to be returned to Ukraine, and that includes Crimea, and that is just a no-go. that is not going to happen. But the fact is they don't really understand the dynamics of what's been going on there and what caused the conflict in the first place. The conflict was caused in the first place by an unwillingness to negotiate on some issues that were legitimate for Russia. And so we have the United States in a position where it's fighting a war by proxy and increasingly directly. And there has been no consent from the American people that this is something we want to do.
So I guess if I were to take the liberty of modifying your title ever so slightly, just by putting a question mark after it, war without end as a question, the answer is yes. In the minds of the neocons and in the minds of the globalists and in the minds of the Pentagon and in the minds of the State Department and in the minds of the White House.
Yeah, and I would observe, of course, the expansion of this war forever to include China now is so nonsensical. I mean, if you're fully engaged in fighting Russia, now suddenly you want to create a situation in which Russia and China will embrace and be strategically opposed to our policies. So how ignorant is this? How stupid is this?
I can't even think of an argument that the neocons could make that the war in Ukraine adversely or Russia's military involvement in Ukraine adversely affects the national security of the United States. They can't even make that argument with a straight face, can they, Phil?
No, they don't make that argument. In fact, they never explain why the United States is threatened by or was threatened by the Russian intervention in Ukraine, which was a local issue based on national security conditions that were prevailing at that time. They never make that argument. All they do is the same thing that our president did last night. You just keep repeating the word freedom over and over and over again till it reaches the saturation point and nobody's listening to you anyway.
And nobody's listening to you anyway. Phil Giraldi, always a pleasure. This piece, War Without End, which appears in the UNZ review and at LouRockwell.com yesterday, November 2nd, 2022, by Philip Giraldi, is a masterpiece, and I highly commend it to everybody watching and listening to us now. Phil, thank you for joining us. All the best.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Of course, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.